Hey guys, Editor Jared here. I just wanted to let you know that in the description of this video is a download link for the exact project file that I build and that I save as my default scene for Blender at the end of the video, along with the free HDRI from Polyhaven that is included. So if you want to download that, open it up, save it as your default scene so that for the rest of the videos, your scene is basically built exactly the same as mine, you can go ahead and do that. I would strongly encourage that you watch the video to kind of learn some of the processes though. What's up guys, my name is Jared and welcome back to my introductory series on Octane Renderer for Blender. In the last chapter, we covered installation and initial setup of Blender Octane Edition, so if you don't have that installed, go back and watch that previous video and then come back to this one where you'll learn how to do some cool stuff with it. In this chapter, we're going to get you out of the black screen stage. We're going to cover a lot of basic settings as it relates to Octane, like world settings, node graphs, how to set up some really basic lighting so that you have a default scene that you can kind of work based off of in the future. We're going to cover some Octane settings. We're going to cover Octane camera imager and post-processing. There's a lot that we're going to go over here, and it might sound like a lot or seem like a lot, but this is all just stuff that will help you get started, and we'll cover them all in much greater depth in future videos. So without wasting any more time, let's go ahead and make sure that our Octane Studio server is launched, or Octane Server Studio, sorry, is launched, so that Octane is licensed on our computer. So I'm just going to come down into my system tray and click the icon, and we will activate our Otoy account on our computer. I'll hit close and now we can open up Blender. And you'll see that we left off the last episode with more or less a default Blender scene. Let's go ahead and get started by making some user interface changes that are going to give us some nice quality of life. These are not even necessarily related to Octane. These are things that I do in every version of Blender regardless of where I am. Make note that between the last episode and this, I enabled screencast keys, so you will be able to see every keystroke that I make in the bottom left corner. I'm going to delete everything from our default scene because we are going to reset all that up as it relates to Octane here in just a moment. Let's drag out a new panel, which if you don't know how to do that in Blender, you can come to pretty much any corner, hover over it until you see the little crosshair, and then just drag in the direction you want a new panel to appear. And I like to split up my layers and my properties so that I have more room to work on each of those. So I'm going to come up and just turn this into my outliner, and then I will right click in between these two original panels, join areas, and make sure that it indicates that we're joining upwards so that my render settings are over here. This is just how I like to work. You can set your user interface up however you want, but I believe for the purpose of this series, it'll help to have all the Octane settings kind of on their own panel over here. I'm going to hit T on my keyboard to get rid of my tools panel because it's not very often that I'm using that. And then I'm going to come up to, I believe it is this button, or maybe it is this one, the viewport gizmos, and I'm going to turn off the navigation gizmos. I've never personally used them. Maybe if you're working on a laptop, you use these. I have never personally used them, and I don't find them very fun to look at, so I'm going to turn those off. Next, I'm going to come over to the shading tab, and you can see that that automatically starts our Octane viewport, which gives us, if I come over to world mode, you can see that that gives us an Octane daylight by default. Now that may or may not be the case for you depending on the version that you're using, but I'm going to delete the original cycles background and set my world output to only display the Octane versions. And I'll just leave this daylight in here for now. We're going to talk about world settings in just a second. So if you want to see that, you can skip to that chapter of the video. But I'm just going to focus on the user interface for now. I don't really use the file browser, so I'm going to join the areas this way. And then I'm going to also join down to get rid of this shader graph because I'm going to drag out another one. I like to have my shader graph vertical as opposed to horizontal because You can see we have a lot of options when it comes to Octane, and when that shader graph is horizontal, a lot of times when you hit Shift A in here, it won't come up where you can just kind of search by default. Down here in this little corner, I'm going to bring up that UV editor that we just closed because I like to have that available, but not prominent. These are the main two tabs that we're going to be using. I'm actually going to delete modeling, sculpting, UV editing, texture painting, and I will leave animation. I will switch this window in animation to be a graph editor. I will leave rendering, compositing, geometry nodes, and I will delete scripting. And so this is kind of how I set up my Blender user interface by default. And I'll just come up to File, Defaults, Save Startup File, Default, Save Startup File, and then click. And now every time we open, this will be what our user interface looks like. Now, if I start my Octane viewport, like I said, you can see we have a daylight. I'm going to add in a monkey head that we will kind of use as the basis of everything else that we do today, just as a simple object that we can kind of visualize. I like to see kind of an overlay wireframe of any geometry that I'm looking at in the viewport. So I'm going to come over here to my viewport overlays, turn on wireframe, and then I'm going to turn its opacity down to a 0.2. I just like to lightly be able to see the geometry of whatever I'm working on. Now let's head back over to our shading tab and just kind of let's look around in here since this is where we got started. I'm going to take this shader editor and I'm going to switch it to my world settings, and you can see that we have a daylight environment. Now there are really two main types of environments that you can have in Octane, and if I just hit search and search environment, well, I suppose there's three, but I've personally never used the planetary. The main two that you're going to find yourself using are the daylight environment, which we get by default, and a texture environment. The daylight environment, a lot of these settings are going to be fairly self-explanatory. Your sky color is going to change your sky color, sunset color, just kind of depending on the north offset of your sun, you can get some of the sunset color in there. Sun size, the sun is physically in the scene, so you can change the sun size to be, I would consider this to be pretty sci-fi if you want to. And then by default, obviously, sun direction is driven by this sun direction here, where you can change longitude, latitude, down to month, day, year, and time, so that you can get very specific with the location of your sun. Now, the second type of environment, and the one that I would say most people probably use most often, is going to be a texture environment. This is going to be how we make an HDRI setup, and so I'm going to go ahead and disconnect my daylight environment, which is going to give us a black screen, and just kind of show you how I set up an HDRI. So I'm going to plug my texture environment straight into this Octane environment, and you'll see that whatever is driving this texture, for now this color, becomes the full environment in your viewport. I'm going to hit Shift A and add in an RGB image, which is an Octane input that you will use a lot for all kinds of stuff, including loading in HDRIs. You can load in any HDRI you want. I'm going to use Studio Small 058K. This is from Polyhaven. It is free. There will be a link in the description. Most of you probably have it. I feel like everybody has this HDRI. And you can plug this into your texture. And then we will start to see our studio lighting in here. Comes in a little hot by default, so I'm going to turn its strength or its power down to like something like 0.2. And you can see now that we have an image-driven environment. You can turn basically any image into an HDRI with Octane, as I'm sure you can with Cycles. I just can't recall off the top of my head at the moment. But in Octane, you can hit Shift A and add in a spherical projection, which will do exactly what it says. It will spherically project any image. If I plug it in here, it's not going to do anything because this image is already a 360 sphere. but you can basically turn any image into an HDRI using this. What if you don't want to see this image though? What if you want to just have a black background and just use this HDRI for reflections or for just diffuse lighting or anything like that? Well, we can duplicate this texture environment and plug this into the Octane visible environment and then tick this little button that says backplate. And now you can see that we can make this backplate any color you want. So normally I will just roll with a black background, and now we have some good lighting and a black background, which is generally my starting point when I'm working on product renderings. I am not, however, a big fan of the color that we're getting from this. So in Cycles, I believe you would use maybe it's just a hue saturation node, but in Octane, we have a node called Color Correction, which handles all kinds of stuff in one node, whereas I believe with Cycles you have to use a couple nodes to get all of these different settings. But I can just add this color correction node in between my image and my texture environment, and then I can desaturate this completely. And now we have a nice little starting point for our lighting. So that's a quick overview of some world lighting settings in Octane. We have our daylight environment, and like I said, our texture environment is currently driving a backplate. But we have our daylight environment, and then we have our texture environment, and they each accomplish different things, but those are kind of the bases for the lighting setups that you'll be using in the world settings. This HDRI isn't giving quite enough light though, so let's come back over to our layout tab and discuss how we might add in another light. We can just hit Shift A in our viewport and come down to lights, and you can see that we now have access to all of the native Octane lights. So Octane can use regular Blender default lights. If I add in an area light here, you can see if I come over to the light settings, I can click Use Nodes, or I can tick Used as Octane Mesh Light. So you can convert regular Blender lights to Octane lights, but it's more efficient to just use an Octane area light. So if I start up my IPR, drag this up, you can see it is in fact emitting light. And what I'm going to do for the sake of our default scene is hit Shift A and add in an empty plane axis, and I'm going to call this light target. And then I'm going to come into my Octane area light, add a constraint, a track to constraint. I'm going to track this area light to my light target. And so now, wherever I put this, it will look directly at our Suzanne head, or more specifically, our light target. So if I move the target around, you can see that it's targeting that. Let's move these into a collection so that they stay organized. Let's just select them both and hit M, New Collection, Lighting. In each Octane light, there are some unique Octane settings that you can run through. The most important ones, in my opinion, are these checkboxes here, which determine what your light is visible to. So for example, I can turn off camera visibility, and now our light is emitting light, but it is not visible to our Octane camera. You can turn off shadow visibility as well, and dirt visibility, and then curvature visibility. The rest of these settings are more advanced, and I'm not really going to cover them in this series, I don't think, but just know that whenever you don't want a light to be seen by your camera, for example, you do that in these Octane settings. And since we made this area light with this track to constraint, this is now something that we can just duplicate down, for example, so that I can get some fill coming from this bottom area. And now we have a really simple 3-point lighting setup when combined with our HDRI. And this is going to be just a good lighting setup to kind of have by default. I'm going to turn off my Octane IPR. And now that we have our world settings set up and some lighting in the scene, let's go ahead and set up an Octane camera. I'm going to hit Shift A, and we use the default Blender camera for this because it has Octane settings built in by default. I'll hit N on my keyboard so that I can take this camera, and I'm going to put its X rotation to 90, and then I'm going to zero out the other two rotation values. Let's take our Y location to something like -4, and then let's scale down our Suzanne head to sort of fit this scene a little better. Let's change our resolution over in the output properties to like 3000 by 3000 and set our screen space percentage to 50 so that we can do preview renders at half the resolution by default. And now we have the basics of our camera setup. Octane uses Blender's default camera settings for the lens and sensor size, for example, as well as all of its viewport displays. So I'm going to set my focal length to 75 millimeters, and I'm going to set my camera sensor size to 22. Let's hit 0 to see how our Suzanne head size is doing, and I'm going to go ahead and scale her down until she's about this size, and then I'm going to hit Control A and apply my scale. This is a pretty typical scene scale that I work at. This is why I'm doing this. If you work on massive scene scales frequently, you should tailor this to your use case. Let's come into our camera here and let's go to the Octane camera settings. We're going to use the default Octane camera for the sake of this series. I'm going to do a whole video when it's done about the universal camera because the universal camera has some more settings and some more advanced features that I do use frequently, so I am kind of passionate about the universal camera. But for the sake of getting started, let's use the default camera, and the main thing that we are going to need to do is change our focus settings or our depth of field. Let's hit Shift A and add in an empty plane axis, and let's call this camera focus. And we're going to use this for a very similar thing that we use the light target for, except in relation to our depth of field. Let's turn off autofocus and use our camera focus empty to drive our depth of field. And if I hit 0 and turn back on my viewport, let me just, for example, duplicate my Suzanne head, move it around a couple times, and so you can start to see our depth of field is in fact doing some work. If I turn off my overlays, you can see that even better. And for the sake of the video, let's turn this up, this depth of field, let's turn this aperture number up to like 3, and you can really see that that depth of field is doing some work. One nice thing about Octane that you don't really get with Cycles is you can check this Use f-stop button if you, for example, are a photographer or videographer and you know f-stop better. You can just turn this on. You can set it to whatever value you like. So if I set it to f10, obviously we're going to get less depth of field. If I set it to f1.2, obviously we're going to get some nice creamy depth of field in the back. And that's kind of the basics of using depth of field in Octane. Turn our viewport off and turn our overlays back on. I'm going to hit 7 on my keyboard to come to the top view, and I'm going to take my camera focus and move it forward to the front of our subject. This is obviously going to change sort of scene to scene. Like we did with our light target as well, I'm going to scale down this empty so that it just doesn't take up nearly as much space in the scene. And then similarly, let's go ahead and move these into their own collection called cameras. All of this is just sort of staying organized. I'm going to delete the 2 extra Suzannes because we do not need them. So now we have our world, we have a camera, we have lights. Let's put a default texture on our Suzanne so that I can introduce you to the Octane material system. Let's first add in a subdivision surface modifier and right click and shade smooth on this. And then let's head over to our shading tab, hit 0 on our keyboard, and let's turn off all these extras so that we can just see what's going on. I'm going to delete my daylight environment and then head on over into object mode and create a new material on Suzanne. Now, if you've never seen an Octane universal material before, this is going to look like a lot of stuff compared to the Cycles principled BSDF. And that's because it is a lot of stuff, but it's a really, really cool material system. In here, you have virtually every option you could possibly want in one material. Luckily, if you are overwhelmed by this, there are other materials you can use. If I just search material in here, you can see that we have, I think the main materials are the glossy material, which you can see this is just a regular kind of glossy material that you would use for plastics and such. There's a diffuse material that you would use for diffuse, emissive, just more simple materials that don't have a ton of glossiness to them. There's a specular material that you would use for glasses, plastics, stuff like that. But the universal material is sort of all of these rolled into one, where you can combine different effects and do a bunch of cool stuff. So I leave it as my default, but if you want to change it, you can go to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, Octane, and you can change your default material type to any of these other materials, basically. So taking a look at this universal material, let's just kind of go through what all is going on here. So we have our transmission layer, which lets us, for example, we can add an RGB color here, and we can set it to a white. And so now our object is transmissive, but we still have a material color. So if I take this down to 0, you can see now we have kind of a glass type material going on here. So for example, that is how sort of getting a specular layer works in the universal material. Albedo is your color. It's your base color for your object. Whenever you're doing PBR materials, this is where you will plug in your color maps. I'm just going to set this to a blue for now. Metallic is obviously your metalness value. I think that Octane handles metals better than any other render engine I've ever used, bar none. I absolutely love working with metallic materials in Octane. It truly is a joy. It has this metallic edge tint value that you can see if I just make this like a totally different color, like a green. And if I turn my metallic all the way up, you can see that on the edge of metals, it will let you kind of blend it into another color. As an example, this would be used for something like car paint, like where, you know, if the light catches it just right, it kind of flows into another color. I'm just going to reset these values for now. I'll set my metallic to like a 0.5, and we'll just kind of keep going with this as our default material. Roughness is roughness is roughness, no matter what render engine you are using. Anisotropy, rotation, spread, very rarely used in the roughness in my personal experience. I'll just kind of close these up as we go. IOR, this is obviously your refractive index. Whenever you're working with glass, water, any other liquid, anything like that, your IOR comes into play. Lots of other settings in this section. I think the only other one to make good note of is allow caustics right here. If ever you need to do something where light is shining through glass or water or anything like that, this button comes into play. Coding layer, I am a big fan of this, and I use it on product labels all the time. Basically, your coding layer, it's probably easier to show than to tell, but if I turn the coding all the way up and the roughness all the way down, for example, then you can see in an area maybe like this that we have almost just like a clear coat. I'll go back to my car paint example. You have almost like a clear coat going on here that is just kind of sitting on top of your material. And I think it's a really, really nice effect. And that has its own roughness channel. So if you were doing something like frost, for example, if you were trying to do that on like a cold can or something, you would use basically like a pure white coating layer, and then you could make the roughness into like a frost texture or something like that. Has its own roughness, has its own IOR, very cool setting there. Thin film. Thin film is very similar, but it is a dispersive effect. Again, kind of goes back to car paints and like really unique car wraps and stuff like that. It also works, this is how you would do stuff like bubbles, for example, that would have a dispersive thin film layer to them. I'm going to just kind of leave this off, close it up. Sheen, I feel like this is fairly self-explanatory, but it kind of goes more in the direction of how light is sort of caught on a model, if that makes sense. Geometry properties, here you have stuff like bump, normal, displacement. round edges. You can manage AOVs. You can turn an object into a shadow catcher. So if I enable this, and for example, if there was another object sitting on top of it, then this could act as just a transparent shadow catcher for that object, so that you could have, for example, an object sitting on top of a floor where you want the shadow to show through, but not actually render it out. You would just render the shadow. That's how you would do that. And so that is a brief overview of the Octane Universal material. There's a couple things in the node editor itself that I would like to draw some attention to. The biggest one, in my opinion, is the fact that Octane has a node for Cinema 4D noise. I find that both hilarious and amazing because Cinema 4D's noise engine is significantly better than Blender's. Like, it's not even remotely close. So for example, if I were to put this into my bump output, we aren't really going to see anything for the moment. Let me put it into my base layer as well. And then let's add in a 3D transformation, which is how we do rotation, scale, and translation effects in Octane. And I'll just put this into my UVW transform and scale this noise way, way down. Let's make it so we can kind of see how this is going. And this is very cool. It's giving us sort of a box noise effect. I'll take it out of the albedo and leave it in the bump for now. And so Cinema 4D has all these different types of noise. Some of my most used ones are Luca, Nakai. I've used Fire a lot. I've used Electric a lot. And you can get some really, really unique looking effects with all of the different types of Cinema 4D noise. A lot of times I will use this as my bump input on like a product label that has sort of like a papery texture to it. I'll use something like this. I'll turn it down to 0.002 or something, and then I'll even turn the power down a little bit, and you can see that that is just kind of giving a whole lot of texture to this model. So Cinema 4D noise in Blender is extremely cool to me. Other things worth noting are Octane Vertex displacement. If I disconnect these from the bump and kind of drag them over here, let's plug this texture into the texture of an Octane Vertex displacement and put the displacement out into displacement down here. And you can see now that we get some craziness going on. Vertex displacement is what I would call a much more mathematical approach to displacement. The other option is texture displacement. And you can see here that texture displacement, even though it takes in kind of the same sort of input, it's much more just based on the values in the image, whereas vertex displacement, you can select input axes. You can add subdivision almost like you would with like redshift tessellation, for example, and you also have this auto bump map option. So I just prefer to use vertex displacement in basically all scenarios, but yeah, totally up to you. One of the main reasons that I like it, if I set this down to like 0.1, is for this subdivision level. So if I set this to like 3, you can see we're going to get some insane detail brought into this. And that's just an extremely handy feature to have built right into the displacement node, in my opinion. So those are just a couple of really cool things about the node editor in Octane, as well as a quick overview of the universal material. Now that we have this kind of set up, let's go ahead and jump back over to our layout. I'll turn my IPR off over here, go back to layout, turn my IPR on. And then I think the last thing that we're gonna do before we close out this episode is come into our in panel and talk about the Octane camera imager as well as Octane PostProcess. The camera imager is where a lot of I would call visual changes happen in terms of like exposure, for example. You have full control, and this will be sort of baked into your final image unless you're using an ACES workflow. But you have full control over your camera exposure here. Hot pixel removal, it's a good idea to always set this really to something like 0.8 because Octane does produce some hot pixels, or just like basically white pixels on any image that you'll want to remove or have to remove manually if you don't turn this on. So setting this on something like 0.8, always a good idea in my personal opinion. Not going to mess with OCIO. We turned on ACES tone mapping. If I turn this off, you can see we just get a lot more. ACES is sort of just the gold standard for color and light calculation, in my opinion. Denoiser is not something that I would turn on in the viewport, as it does slow things down, where Octane in general is very snappy. In my opinion, it's actually quicker than Cycles in the viewport. So you don't really want to do too much to slow that down. Denoiser, though, you will want to turn on when it comes time to render, and we'll talk about render passes in just a second. Upsampler, I turn off. That sort of wraps up camera imager. Octane post-process. So bloom, obviously, if you are a Blender user and you use Eevee, you know what bloom is. It's sort of just kind of a glow. The more you turn it up, the more an object will glow. When I first switched to Blender and was using Cycles, it was always kind of befuddling to me that I couldn't make bloom work natively in Cycles. I had to do it in post. So now that I'm using Octane and Blender again, it's extremely nice to just be able to have bloom built in. Glare, if I turn this up, it's going to be exactly what it sounds like. It's glare. You can adjust the ray count and the angle, and so this will give you something like, if you're really artistic with it, you can do something almost like an anamorphic flare. So if you set the glare ray count to 1 and the angle to 90, you can get something like an anamorphic flare, and then you can kind of turn the power down until it's really subtle, and you can turn the cutoff way up. Cutoff, by the way, is sort of just like a threshold value for the entirety of the post-process. So the higher it is, the earlier these effects getting applied gets cut off in terms of like shadow to highlight values. So if I turn this up, and you can like really dial in a balance between these where you get sort of like an anamorphic flare going on. That's all I wanted to really show with that. I don't typically use glare. I'm going to turn this back down to its default value of 0.1 and then my cutoff back down to 0 for now. You can also blur those glares, but that sort of accomplishes the same thing as bloom, so I personally have never used it. Spectral intensity and spectral shift. So you can turn your spectral intensity up and get sort of these interesting sort of, how would you even describe these? These very stylized glowing areas, and then you can shift where exactly, almost like hue shift these basically. So I can make them really sort of art directed in the blue direction if I want to, or something like that. That is also an effect that I don't use very often. So let's just turn our cutoff up to 1, and now we have just kind of a subtle sort of bloom going on here. And let's call this our final export. Since we're calling it our final export, let's go back into our camera imager, and at this point, let's turn on our denoiser. I'm going to duplicate my Suzanne head again, just for the sake of rendering, to give us something a little more interesting to export. Let's go just something like this. And now I think this composition will work well. So now I just want to take you through sort of the export process from Octane. We're going to use some render passes. So let's come down to our view layer properties, and we have passes options here. I'm going to turn on a beauty pass. I'm going to turn on a denoiser beauty pass, and I'm going to turn on wireframe and AO passes. If you've never worked with passes, then I would skip this and just sort of export your image as a PNG or whatever you normally export it as. This is more just for those who are looking to be able to do passes. Let's turn some of these on. And then you can come up to the Octane kernel. Let's set our max samples to 512. Let's set our preview samples, don't matter right now, but they're good at 128. I generally set all of my depths to 12 for final export, but this will vary sort of scene to scene. GI clamp set at 16, that is good. All of these are fine. If you want to render an alpha channel, you can render the alpha channel. And then adaptive sampling is on, and that is really all there is to rendering with Octane. I'll turn off motion blur and come into our output settings. Since I turned on passes, I'm going to render as an open EXR multi-layer. If you are not exporting passes and you're just exporting an image, I would just use a PNG. This Octane output folder is here, but it is not necessary to use. You can just export straight from Blender, and I will just place this in my documents folder called temp, and I will call this Octane tutorial output, and I'll save that. And then, my friends, we are ready to come up to render and hit render image. And now, my friends, we have a full scene that is fully set up for rendering, and this is something that we can now save to be our default scene so that we don't have to do any of this sort of initial setup like adding in our world and stuff. I'm going to delete the 2 Suzanne heads that I don't need, as well as come over to the shading tab and delete this material that I don't need. And so if I turn my IPR on, now we can see that we just have some nice default settings that we can load up with every time. I'm going to come back out to my world area, set up my camera where I would like it to be when I open Blender, and I'm just going to come to File, Cleanup, Unused Data Blocks. File, Cleanup, Unused Data Blocks. And then let's go File, Defaults, Save as Startup File. And so now if I close this out, we can open it back up, and we are fully set up for success in Blender Octane Edition. I hope that this introduction was helpful to you. We learned a lot about Blender Octane Edition, and I'm extremely excited because next chapter we are going to start building a full scene from start to finish for a product animation in Blender Octane Edition. Until then, I will see you next time. Please feel free to leave any questions in the comments or shoot me a DM on Instagram. All those links are in the description, as well as any downloads that I mentioned during the video. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next chapter.